Welcome, colleagues, to our Center of Reforms, and we're trying to communicate about reforms in Ukraine every day. And now we'd like to speak about quite a technical law that was approved in the parliament. And now it's the president as the quarantine of plants as part of legislation is in the end of reforms of the market of grain in Ukraine, in addition to other deregulation measures. And Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food, Volodymyr Lapa, will tell us about this in details. Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. I will try to briefly tell you about our view in the context of this draft law. And when the new team came to the Ministry of Agrarian Policy, we had a clear understanding that the phytosanitary regulation sector is one of the most corrupted in general in agriculture industry of Ukraine. We clearly understood shortcomings in the regulation and quarantine certificates when it's impossible to get it at the place of unloading at small storage facilities, and it caused that owners didn't use quarantine certificates, and that's why they unofficially paid when those cargoes came to ports or to other places where they disembarked them. And corruption was on the level of 1 billion hryvnia a year. That's unofficial load on business. The government passed a regulation, MH42, that regulates a lot of aspects of quarantine of plants, and by that regulation, that provides voluntary quarantines when you transport grains, and that prevents corruption. That regulation provides a necessity to issue phytosanitary certificate during 22 hours since the moment when it was a truck was loaded and an application was submitted. That's a big the regulation in that field. Unfortunately, not all issues can be regulated on the level of the regulation of the Cabinet of Ministers. So we are thankful to some MPs that developed and registered draft law. It has a very long name. Draft law on amendments to the law of Ukraine on quarantine of plants and the reformation of the system regulation in the field and the aspect and sanitary measures according to internal standards and obligations. And in fact, the draft law strengthens those positions on the level of the regulation of the Cabinet of Ministers, and the reforms in this field on the level of legislation are irreversible. 24 hours, that's the term, fixed term to get a certificate, phytosanitary certificate. And what's the problem? Because it can be issued in a day or in 5 days, and on those 5 days cargo is, the ship is loaded and idle, or a car is waiting for customs documents on the border. That's a big problem, and that caused unproductive losses on the freight of ships when they were loaded and they were waiting for a phytosanitary certificate. So the draft law passed in the parliament and provides a necessity to issue that certificate in 24 hours after a ship is loaded or after a train car is loaded. The second point, which is regulated by that law, is an opportunity, a chance to get some list of products under phytosanitary and quarantine control. So there will be separate list of products for import that will be caused by hazards, and on the territory of Ukraine there will be separate list of products that must be controlled when exported, and that will be requirements of important countries, and that will meet the list of quarantine facilities in Ukraine. And in our agricultural products, and one more list which will be narrow. It will be a necessity to get quarantine certificates for internal movement of agricultural products. So in such a way, on the level of the law, we realize those activities, and we make them irreversible on the level of that regulation of the Cabinet of Ministers. One more positive thing in this law is, unfortunately, historically, it happened that the legislation, there was a norm that a necessity to get quarantine certificate. Whether you bring in or out to quarantine area, there was a paradoxical situation when from clean area grain was taken to elevators in quarantine areas, and you had to get a quarantine certificate for that. That issue is regulated by the law, and it provides that the necessity to get a quarantine certificate for that list of products approved by the Cabinet of Ministers that will be provided only when you take grain from quarantine area, where it's pure or where there is no need to get that document. So a draft law, or the laws have passed in the parliament. It came to a Ministry of Agrarian Policy, and we provided our recommendations to the Cabinet of Ministers as to necessity to sign by the President that law for it to come into force, and we hope that it will be done in the near future, and we hope that the reforms in that part of quarantine phytosanitary regulation will be irreversible, and they will forget about those times when business complained about imperfect regulation in the field of competence of agrarian policy. So I would like to say the position of the ministry has changed radically, and if any initiatives for deregulation, they were blocked by public servants, and now the Minister of Agrarian Policy is a driver of this process, and our task is to create such conditions in the agrarian sector that are attractive for international and investors in local produce, because the potential has not expired. This is very briefly about the draft law. If there is any question, I'll be happy to answer. The question is, together with the law 1193 from the last year, regulation 42 this year, and this law, they resolve corruption on the market of grain in Ukraine. On the level of legislation, it resolves all the corruption risks because our work is not limited by legislation. After the regulation of the Cabinet of Ministers was passed, after it was regulated on the level of Cabinet of Ministers, there was an explanation of phyto service on regional level for them to follow the law and to comply with the law. And we know some problematic regions, and there were some problems with execution. We invited them to the ministry. We educated them. So the issue is resolved, and phyto service monitors certificates issue, and for business to have a chance to get those documents in 24 hours. So the system is not only introduced, but it's in full-fledged work. Thank you very much. Here's a question.
Ukrinform, could you please tell why did you decide to make several lists for testing? And the second question, what will be the load on quarantine bodies? The conditions are worsening, and it could lead to worsening of the quality. Talking about worsening of the quality, deterioration of the quality, it's not the issue of quarantine bodies, but it's also is set according to the risks. And the thing is that the in southern regions, they have finished the harvesting, and we see worsening of the quality of the grain. But according to our assessment, about 60% of the wheat satisfies the consumer quality, and we believe, have the quality which is an average for Ukraine. We do not see any radical increase of loading on the phytosanitary inspections, and that is because number of the applications for quarantine certificates, which are now voluntary, this number has reduced. Some of the companies come to us, and if we tell the companies if they see certain risks, they should receive the documents so that to have certain insurance. But the loading on a phytosanitary service has decreased now, basically. Toronto.
I would like to ask a question. Why is there a need of quarantine? Second question, how would you relate the new laws and compare it with the laws dealing with wheat in similar exporting countries like Canada and the United States? Thank you very much.
Необхідність карантину.
The necessity for quarantine regulation is related to our international commitments. Talking about export, issuing of phytosanitary certificate means that from the point of view of phytosanitary inspection of Ukraine, the wheat corresponds to the requirements of the importing country. We have no complaints from our trade partners, and the certificate that was issued is usually confirmed in the port of the country that is buying the wheat, and we believe that this system is quite efficient now. The second component of phytosanitary security relates to the risk of bringing the quarantine, those organisms which fall under the quarantine onto the territory of Ukraine, and we need to control this so that the organisms which do not exist in Ukraine are not brought to Ukraine. And then the question is, your next question about this list, it's about domestic transportation of agricultural products. We will submit some documents to the Cabinet of Ministers, and we believe that the list of products which are to be mandatorily controlled in domestic transportation should be much narrower. Only those agricultural products which have biggest risks will be controlled internally. So in general, the system of regulation, the new system, is more liberal than the one we had 2 or 3 years ago, and we are working on examining the best world practices within the context of Euro integration. We were examining the best practices of European Union. In European Union, they don't have the quarantine certificate, while for internal transportation, we are not ready to refuse from it completely, but in the future, we understand that we need to switch to the system which exists in the EU, and we need to move to the control of the zones where the organisms which fall under control exist, so that we develop the passport of the plants, and in 3-4 years we will move to this system completely. Any other questions? If not, then thank you, Volodymyr, for explaining the policy. And I would like to remind you that this law is one of the key ones for reforming and normalizing the work of the market of grain in Ukraine, which is one of the most powerful markets in Ukraine. I can also quote a couple of figures for journalists. These are the results of harvesting. As of 27, we harvested 23.6 million tons, 23,658,000 tons. We harvested at the area of 68% of the total harvest area, which is more than 7 million hectares. Out of these volumes, 16.9 million tons wheat, 6 point something barley, the P 350,000 tons. And the brief information on the volumes of export. As of yesterday, we are exporting 1 million. We have exported 1,830,000 tons, out of which 492,000 tons of wheat, 548 of barley, and 831,000 of corn. Talking about the volumes which are ready to be loaded on vessels, 319,000 tons. So we expect that the total export in June will be 2.2 million tons. In July will be 2.2 million tons, maybe bigger. That is quite a good dynamic, taking into account the fact that the works in the south and in the center are now delayed because of the weather conditions. Some comment? Can you compare that to the previous year? We are lagging behind because of the weather, even though we have caught up now. This year, 7,031,000 hectares. Talking about harvest, it's at the level of the previous year, 23.6 last year. So we are practically having the same figures as last year. Thank you. All